Hello fellow cyborgs and welcome to another 0 by 19 update. I'm a little ill, so pardon the croakiness. In my updates, I will tell you about the books that I have recently read, the books that I have recently hauled, the books that I am planning on reading, and the current numerical state of my physical TBR. So let's get started with the books I finished. I have a Victober wrap up for you, but I want to wrap up the books that were not Victorian first. I listened to The House at Riverton by Kate Morton. This is a historical fiction novel set partway in like the early 1900s, like up into the 20s, and then current day, which I think was the 90s in this book. Grace was a housemaid at Riverton for a well-to-do family in the early 1900s. This is her story of both her life and the lives of the family members, specifically two sisters who lived at Riverton. As with all of Kate Morton's books, you flip backward and forward in time. There is a deep, dark family secret, and there is also lovely writing. I enjoyed this, but I found that the family secret was not that climactic for waiting so long to get to what the actual secret was. I also found that toward the end we're given events out of order, and the climactic moment is like the final thing that we are left with as readers. For me, that didn't work because I wanted resolution at the end of the story, but I had already received the resolution before I knew what it was actually resolving. It's a little confusing to talk about. I ended up giving this 3 stars. It definitely was entertaining and I really enjoyed the writing style. Kate Morton really knows how to capture character and subtle human psychology, but the mystery didn't blow me away, but I still will probably read more by Kate Morton. Then I read The Screaming Staircase by Jonathan Stroud, I think. This is a late middle grade horror novel about a world where the problem has happened, and the problem is an overabundance of hauntings in the UK, but also I think around the world. And the problem is that adults can no longer see specters and spirits, but these specters and spirits and ghosts can physically touch and kill humans. So in this world, you have bands of children who are psychically gifted and can still see these spirits trying to handle hauntings and move the ghosts on or get rid of the ghosts. This is the beginning of the Lockwood & Co. series, and Lockwood & Co. is the band of kids who we're following. There's Lockwood, George, and Lucy. Lockwood is the owner of the house and the owner of this company that has only 3 people in it. I've met his sort of character before in other books. I'm thinking specifically Kelsier in the Mistborn trilogy. He's charismatic, people want to follow him, people want to impress him, but he also doesn't know really how to listen, and he makes mistakes but doesn't always admit that he does. He also puts burdens on himself completely because he's the hero and has to do things by himself, and he's bad at disseminating information. One thing I really liked is that The Screaming Staircase was told from Lucy's perspective, the only girl in Lockwood & Company, and she has had a kind of a harrowing past. I think this story would have been insufferable if Lockwood had been narrating it. I really liked how the horror elements of this story actually were spine-tingling for me. I was at times really tense with what was going on. However, the pacing was a little bit off because the book starts with a super climactic ghost scene, and then we spend the next 50-60 pages on relatively boring backstory, so that was a little bit weird. I also found that there were some plot points and some character tropes that I had seen before and I could anticipate, though to be fair, I am not the target audience of this book. I think if you were a 13-year-old picking this up and hadn't had 28 years of reading like I have under your belt, then you would probably be surprised by some things. I'm interested with continuing with this series, but I did only give this 3 out of 5 stars, so I won't be jumping into the next one immediately. On a similarly spooky vein, I did end up finishing Poems Bewitched and Haunted. This is an Everyman's Library Pocket Poets, and this is collected by and edited by John Hollander. I gave this collection 4 out of 5 stars if I remember correctly. I really liked a lot of these poems and I thought that they definitely captured the spooky October feeling for me. It was super enjoyable. I enjoyed this far more than their Christmas poems collection, which I read at the end of last year. I'm really glad that I impulsively decided to pick this up at the last minute a couple months ago, because this definitely did help me get some spooky vibes in through October, which turned out to be a kind of busy and not very Halloween-y month for me. I highly recommend this collection, especially if you like things that go bump in the night. I buddy read My Cousin Rachel with Hilary from Your Robot Friend, and this was incredibly enjoyable. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars, and I think I enjoyed it more than Rebecca. Just a smidge, but more. Sorry about the glare. My Cousin Rachel, I believe, is set in the Victorian era, which worked really well with Victober, even though this was not written in the Victorian era. And it follows Philip. He's our main character, he's our narrator, and he's recounting how my cousin Rachel, or his cousin Rachel, came to be into his life and the life of his guardian Ambrose. As you continue to read, you realize that the phrase my cousin Rachel starts evolving and devolving in how you receive it as a reader based upon how Philip is viewing his cousin Rachel. I loved the writing style. This was so spooky and atmospheric. This was just a delightful read. It had me second guessing, and we definitely don't get all of the information we possibly could, but I found that that ambiguity will make the rereading experience just enjoyable every time that you do reread. Your theories about what's actually going on will change as you continue to read, and I think that that's a marvelous thing. This was definitely one of the highlights of my reading month, and I highly recommend that you pick this up, even if you've already read Rebecca or if you haven't. This is just a wonderful place to start with Daphne du Maurier. My final non-Victorian read was Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. This was the second Austen I read, and I think I read it in 2012. I remembered nothing about it. I think I gave it 3 stars at the time, but because I didn't remember anything, I kind of didn't think very highly of Northanger Abbey. So I recently reread this with one of my friends, and oh my gosh, this might be my favorite Jane Austen. I need to reread Emma sometime soon to compare, but Northanger Abbey was just a delightful romp the whole way through. The characterization was spot on, as always with Austen, but in this case, the villainous characters still really amused me. Unlike in Persuasion, some of the nastier characters just kind of dragged the story down for me. In this, they were delightfully hateful. This follows Catherine Morland, who's about 15, I think, and she's going to Bath with a family friend. In Bath, it's where all the society is happening, where parties, you can meet people and find husbands and stuff like that. And Catherine knows so little about life because she's a 15-year-old in the Regency era. She meets a new friend in Isabella Thorpe and also the incredibly flirtatious Henry Tilney. Catherine loves Gothic novels. It's her favorite thing, and the love of this genre colors how she sees the world. She has an incredibly active imagination, which is really adorable to read about, because I know I've had those moments where it's like, oh, wouldn't it be exciting if this thing happened right now? But then you're just still sitting in the car with mom and dad and nothing exciting is actually happening. Throughout this novel, Catherine learns who is really trustworthy, the true motives behind people, and who she actually is, because she's not actually a Gothic heroine, so who is Catherine? This was just so incredibly delightful, and I think of all of the Austen heroes, Henry Tilney would be the one that I would like to shack up with, because he is just adorable and delightful and kind. He is a less father figure-y Mr. Knightley. That's the one thing about Emma that's a little bit weird, is Mr. Knightley and his relationship with Emma. It's a little strange. So anyway, Northanger Abbey, if you have discounted it as the Austen you don't need to read, you're missing out. This was a delight. I highly recommend you read it. Okay, let's move on to the Victober wrap up. I am going to start this off from the least enjoyed to the most enjoyed, and the least enjoyed was a 1-star pick. This was The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I buddy read this with M.A. Anders, and I must say that our buddy reading experience was delightful, even if the book ended up not being so much that for me. Let's do a little disclaimer here, because I must admit that the bulk of why I did not enjoy The Woman in White was because I could not remove my modern reader hat while reading this. So my modern sensibilities looked on a lot of the things that were going on in this book and just was really, really disappointed and angry. If I was looking at this with a less modern sort of view, perhaps I would have enjoyed this more, but I couldn't do that. So to talk about the strong points of The Woman in White, this is one of the first mystery novels, and it is great in giving you the detailed accounts, all of the details that you need to know to figure out this mystery yourself. This is no Sherlock Holmes story where Sherlock goes off stage and finds out things that the reader has no possibility of finding out and figuring it out before Sherlock or with Sherlock. So I liked that. I also liked that the pacing of this, it was pretty darn readable. You know, I would have to read 40 pages a day, and that would happen without me like page counting, which is really important and not super common in a lot of classics. Collins was also very much able, when he switched narrator perspective, to switch his writing style. The narrators did feel different, which is really important, and I appreciated that a lot. So the things that made me hate this book, or not hate it, I didn't hate it, but I didn't like it. It wasn't enjoyable. Toward the second half of this book, I had to force myself to sit down and pick it up. It really boils down to all of the isms: the racism, the sexism, homophobia, and fat shaming. Those aren't isms, but you understand. These things that were just embedded in the text and totally fine, or treated as fine by the text. The only two overweight characters where it's pointed out that they are fat are evil, which is not cool. There are two gay characters, one of which I think was coded as gay in the Victorian era, and I think we would code, and then there was another one that we would code as gay now, but I don't think was supposed to be gay when Collins was writing it. The Victorianly coded gay character, I think, he is the least respected character in the entire book, more disrespected than the evil villains in this book. He is just treated with contempt. It's not because he's coded gay, it's because he's an invalid and selfish, but still, it was like the narrators condemned him for his selfishness more than they condemned the evil people who were trying to ruin people's lives. The other potentially gay character hates herself and the fact that she is female, which is just so frustrating because she, Marion, was the best character in this entire book. But every time she would start crying, or anytime there was something about herself that she didn't like, she would say that it was her feminine part, and gosh, if only I were a man. And that was just really depressing to read. The other nail in this coffin was Walter. I found Walter insufferable by the end of this book, and he narrates a good chunk of it. He starts out as just this drawing master, but by the end of this, he is like a action hero, intensely intelligent sleuth, and the most Gary Stew of all Gary Stews I have ever read. So infuriating. So I can't recommend The Woman in White. I think that the story, like the mystery itself, wasn't super exciting and new for me, a reader in 2018. I think I would have enjoyed this better watching an adaptation or even just reading the Wikipedia article, because the length of this book and the amount of detail and repetition and the lack of progressing through the mystery was just sloggy, especially toward the end. So that was my experience of The Woman in White. Take it with a grain of salt, and let's move on to something a little bit better. I gave The Warden by Anthony Trollope 3 out of 5 stars. This is the first book in the Chronicles of Barchester, and I think it's considered the most dry of all of the books. And going into that, I had lower expectations of this than it deserved, but I think that it worked in my favor because I ended up enjoying this more, knowing that I wasn't going to enjoy it, if that makes sense. Mr. Harding is the warden of an almshouse, and he gets a certain salary a year for this almshouse. Mr. Bold is his prospective son-in-law. He's in love with Mr. Harding's daughter, Eleanor. And Mr. Bold one day poses the question of, since the land over time has been producing more profit. Should that extra profit be going to Mr. Harding, the warden, and his salary, or should that profit actually be distributed among the residents of the almshouse? And this starts a pretty heated battle of church politics, journalism, and morality. I found that in my edition, I think it's 170 pages or something like that, because this actually, I'll get to this edition in a second. In those 170 pages, I still found that there was some repetition, that this could have been cut by like 20 pages, but overall, the church politics were not that hard to get into, and I found that the characters were enjoyable to read about, and I'm also just so pumped that I have finally started the Chronicles of Barchester, and I'm really eager to prioritize finishing the series next year in 2019. Let me talk to you about my edition, which is the Oxford World's Classic Edition. This one, you can read the back. The blurb does not spoil anything, which you can't say that for all of them. But this has the warden and then also the two heroines of Plumpington in it. The Two Heroines of Plumpington is a short story that Anthony Trollope wrote to complete the Chronicles of Barchester. So we have the first novel and then the final short story in this volume. I don't understand. I guess the only reason why they decided to do that was because if they didn't, the spine would be too small to put actual text on, which would not be okay. But who in their right mind decided it would be a good idea to put the final story that I'm sure spoils like everything right after the first story in a series of books? I don't get it. I don't get it at all. But you should read The Warden, because you should probably read the Chronicles of Barchester, something. Then I read the Selected Poems of the Brontes. This is edited by Juliet R.V. Barker. This has poems by all four Bronte siblings who survived into early adulthood: Branwell, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. I enjoyed this more than I thought I would. I picked this up a couple years ago and started reading Charlotte's poems and did not get on with them very well at all. But upon rereading those first few poems and reading the rest of the collection, there were poems by every Bronte that I really enjoyed. So I'm really glad that I didn't end up putting this on the donate pile because I didn't get on with the first few poems, because reading their poetry kind of gave me insight into each of their psyches a little bit more, and I ended up really enjoying the reading experience. I will talk about this more in detail in a later video, but for now, I recommend that you pick up the poems if you are into the Brontes and want to read some of their poetry. I also finished Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. My edition contains illustrations by Kipling that also have like an explanation next to them, which gives you like bonus story material, which is incredibly cute. I think I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this a lot. I didn't expect to, but there was something poetic about these short stories because there'd be like a certain phrase that was repeated throughout the story, and it just kind of felt like I was in on like a secret club or something. These are all stories that they're kind of fable-esque, so it's how the camel got his hump, how the elephant got his trunk, that sort of stuff. I really enjoyed the whimsy factor in here, and I didn't expect it to be so whimsical and lovely. I will say that there are some stories where like the moral of the story really bothers me. It does not age well, but overall this was a delightful surprise, and I highly recommend that you pick up Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. It's quite adorable. And finally, I reread North and South, and this got 5 out of 5 stars from me again, because Mr. Thornton is for sure my literary husband. If I had to pick one, it would be Mr. Thornton 100%, and not just because Richard Armitage played him in that questionable adaptation, but because Mr. Thornton is just, he has feelings and he's adorable. So North and South, as you know, Mr. Thornton's in it from that intro. North and South follows Margaret Hale and her family after they move from their country living in Helston to the manufacturing town of Milton in the north of England. There they are strangers to everything and everyone and have a hard time finding their place in this new community, but fortunately Mr. Thornton's there to guide their way. Just kidding. But actually not really. Margaret has to come to terms with her prejudices about northern life and the people there and the tradesmen who run the mills there. She learns to grow up and stop having opinions about things she doesn't understand. And she also learns that those northern folk dudes are actually, they can be pretty cool. Margaret's not my favorite. I recognize that she is a complex character who has had her fair share of crap to deal with, that crap being parents who act more like children than adults, but she definitely, like I said, she has opinions about things that she is ignorant of, and she says, I'm ignorant of this thing, however, and then spouts her opinion at people who are not ignorant of the thing, and it's just like, Margaret. She also becomes friends with, I think that a modern reader would say, are impoverished people, and it doesn't really, isn't bothered by the fact that they're living in poverty and doesn't try to help them or anything. And I know that their pride would be bruised, but these are your friends and they don't have food, so can you share your food, Margaret? But enough harping about Margaret, because like I said, she is a complex character, she does grow and change, and more importantly, Margaret is not the only perspective in this book. You also get a little bit of some other characters, but you get Mr. Thornton, and he is a complex character too. He has had his hardships, and he has feelings, and he changes and learns things just like Margaret, and it is just wonderful. So I mostly love this for Mr. Thornton. However, Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Thornton's mother, Mrs. Hale and Mr. Hale, Margaret's parents, I also really focused on them in this read through and kind of just looking at how they perceive their children and where their prejudices are with their children and how they're parenting. So I definitely got more out of this on my rereading experience. And one of the things that I firmly believe now is that one or two of the chapters at the beginning of this story before they got to Milton should have been sacrificed so we could have had one or two extra chapters at the end. I don't understand. This would just be like perfection if that were the case. This is still, I love it, and it is still 5 out of 5 stars, but man, if we could have just got to Milton a little bit sooner and not left the story as soon, it would just be so much better. But anyway, you should read North and South, and if you don't want to read North and South, you should pick up some Gaskell, because I think she's my second favorite Victorian author. I think Anthony Trollope might be my favorite Victorian author. We'll have to see. Got to keep reading and figure that one out. So those were all of the books that I have read over the month of October. Since I last filmed, I have hauled one book, which I will talk about presently, which puts my physical TBR to 43 books, which I'm at peace with for the beginning of November. Hopefully, I can cut that down and get to the 20s by 2019, pre-Christmas, because who knows what's going to happen with Christmas. So fingers crossed that. The book that I hauled was Shirley by Charlotte Bronte for super secret project plan reasons that you will learn about in a couple of months. The light's going weird. I will move quickly. Moving forward, the things that I'm going to be reading, I will be participating in Nonfiction November tangentially because I will be focusing on the nonfiction I have left on my shelves, which is fairly minimal. I also plan on picking up a couple Steinbeck works in this month. Weirdly, it just worked out that way, but I'm really pumped to be reading. I'll be reading The Grapes of Wrath and To a God Unknown, but I'll talk with you about those in a later video, hopefully halfway through the month. Let me talk to you right now about the books I'm currently working on. I did not manage to finish Barchester Towers, the second book in the Chronicles of Barsetshire by Anthony Trollope, so I am about a third of the way through, and I am going to finish this before moving on to other things. This actually, weirdly, I'll just leave you with this tidbit. I found that the church politics in the first like 100 pages of this were so much more sloggy and incomprehensible than the church politics in the entirety of the Warden. So if you're putting your nose up at the Warden because of that, you really shouldn't. Don't put your nose up at this either, because now that the like setup is gone, we're all into like people feuds and it's really entertaining. But that was something that just surprised me. I'm still enjoying this though and look forward to finishing it and giving you my final thoughts. I am currently buddy reading The Bird's Nest by Shirley Jackson with Acacia Ives. This is the third Jackson that I will be reading this year in 2018, and I am really enjoying this so far. I am enjoying this as much as The Haunting of Hill House, which is my favorite Jackson so far. Really eager to continue reading this and diving into it with Acacia. Little by little, I'm working my way through this Everyman's Library Pocket Poets edition of haiku. This is edited and I think it's translated too, by Peter Washington. So I will keep plugging away at this. I found that I am enjoying it, going slowly. I don't think you can just binge haiku and get much out of it. And finally, this is one of the Steinbecks that I'm going to be picking my way through. I'm about halfway through this. This is Journal of a Novel. These were his small journals that he wrote every day before he sat down to write East of Eden, which is my favorite John Steinbeck and my favorite book of all time. So this is fun to kind of get a better view of Steinbeck as a human and kind of some insights into East of Eden as well. This is also better enjoyed nibbles at a time instead of huge binges. So working my way through that. So those are all the books I'm going to show you today. Please let me know in the comments down below how your Victober went, if you participated, or if you read some really great spooky books in October. And if you have any nonfiction recommendations for me, or just want to share what you're going to read in November, just do that. Just do all of it down in the doobly-doo. Until next time, I hope you are avoiding the cold viruses that are hanging out in public spaces and continue to be lovely.